Hi everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion for Art and Action. This is a series of online events which have been examining the relationship between literary celebrity, literary authorship, and political activism. My name is Ruth Scobie, and I'm going to be just quickly introducing today's panel as one of the series co-conveners, along with Sandra Meyer at the University of Vienna. Art and Action has been running all the way through this summer, and we're really grateful for the support of Torch at the University of Oxford, to the Oxford Centre for Life Writing, Post-Colonial Writers Make Worlds, as well as the Austrian Science Fund and the Stephen Spenders Trust. I'd encourage you, if you're interested, to take a look at our website, there'll be a link in the chat. And that will give you some videos of previous events, as well as information about upcoming events. And there's also some really interesting blog posts and interviews which you can read on similar themes that will link to what we're talking about today. Now, I'm delighted that my job today is to introduce our chair, Professor Elike Bomer of the University of Oxford. I'm also unfortunately slightly nervous about that, since, as most of you will know, if I was going to go through every single one of Elike's achievements and publications, we would be here for most of the hour. As a scholar, Elike has been a trailblazer in post-colonial literary studies. Just to mention her most recent book, hi Elike. Just to mention her most recent scholarly book, Post-Colonial Poetics, a study of how we read post-colonial and world literatures today, which has been extremely well received and praised most recently, I think, by the likes of Homi Bhabha. She's also an acclaimed novelist and short story writer, the author, again, most recently of Shouting in the Dark, and last year the collection To the Volcano and Other Stories. She's written Nelson Mandela, A Very Short Introduction, for OUP. She's edited Robert Baden-Powell's Scouting for Boys. So we're really pleased to have her here as somebody with a really wide variety of kind of expertise and experiences of publishing and of writing. Perhaps especially relevant for today's discussion was Elike's time as a Man Booker International Prize judge from 2013 to 2015. So I'm going to shut up talking now and hand over to Elike. She's going to introduce our panel, and then we're going to have questions. So I would invite everybody, just to start with, to, if you have any questions, to put them in the Q&A. Okay, Elike, thank you.
Thanks very much, Ruth, and thanks to Sandra. It's a real pleasure to be chairing this panel today as part of the Art and Activism Summer Series. The topic of today's discussion, literary celebrity, activism, and the industry, the publishing industry, the book industry, perhaps even the celebrity industry, is one that is very, very close to my heart. Ruth just mentioned very kindly the Nelson Mandela biography that I published a number of years ago now. I'm thinking about doing a new edition, and there that question of politics and the political capital of political celebrity very much comes up in such a sort of megawatt figure as Nelson Mandela. So it's a fabulous topic, and we have a fabulous panel present today to discuss it with us. I'm going to just so that everybody is aware of the format of the discussion. After this brief introduction, I'm going to introduce the panelists to you in alphabetical order, which is also the order in which they will be speaking. They will each address the topic of celebrity, literary celebrity activism and the industry for between 5 and 7 minutes. They will offer remarks and responses from their particular professional and no doubt political take. Then we will have some discussion between ourselves on the panel, and then we will open for questions. So just to reiterate what Ruth was saying, you are very, very welcome at any point in the discussion that something sparks your interest or sparks a question. You're very, very welcome to put those questions in the chat. So the really big questions that we're facing this afternoon: how do authors' political interventions relate to the market activism of industry stakeholders? And then also, maybe flipping that a bit, to what extent does literary work and does extra literary activism, to what extent do those things condition each other? How does the political life of authors impact on their literary life, I suppose, is one simple way of putting it. So to discuss this with me are, and here are the introductions. First, I'm really delighted to welcome onto the panel Alice Guthrie. She's an independent translator and editor specializing in contemporary Arabic literary, academic, and media content. Her translations have been appearing in a broad range of international venues and publications since 2008. And she's been recognized with any number of grants and honors, most recently the Jules Kametsky Translation Prize 2019. Among her many projects is a translation of the Moroccan feminist Malaika Moustadraf, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Malaika Moustadraf's complete works. And as a commissioning editor, she is currently compiling the first ever anthology of queer Arabic writing. She also programs the literary strand of London's Biennale Schuback. And she teaches on the Translation Studies MA at Exeter University. She is an associate of the Stephen Spender Trust. And of course, we have another panelist who is in fact the director of the Stephen Spender Trust. There's a great link up there. Next up, I'm going to invite Daniel Medine for his comments. Daniel is an editor and a professor at the American University of Paris, where he teaches contemporary world literature and editorial practice. His research is concerned with modern fiction from Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, with an emphasis on the global reception of Franz Kafka. He is Associate Director of AUP's, the American University of Paris's Center for Writers and Translators, and one of the editors of its Cahiers series. He's also co-editor of Music and Literature, and he advises the White Review, Edit, and other journals on contemporary international fiction. He has judged leading translation prizes, most notably, and here we have a link up, most notably the Man Booker International Prize 2016, actually the year after my involvement. I now turn to Charlotte Ryland. She is, as I already anticipated, the director of the Stephen Spender Trust and founding director of Queen's College Translation Exchange, an initiative based at the University of Oxford. Through these two organizations, she aims to engage people of all ages and backgrounds in literary translation, promote language learning, and bring translation activities into UK schools. A fantastic enterprise, and one that needs to be, I think, fully applauded. She also works as a lecturer in German at Queen's College, Oxford. And until 2019, she ran New Books in German, an international project promoting literature in German and facilitating translation into English. And then definitely last, but definitely not least, is Alan Taylor, who has been editor and board member of the Scottish Review of Books since 2004. He was deputy and managing editor at the Scotsman and associate editor of the Sunday Herald. He too is a former literary prize judge, a former Booker judge, and he has edited several acclaimed anthologies, including The Assassin's Cloak, The Country Diaries, and Glasgow, the autobiography, a wonderful book. His most recent book is Appointment in Arezzo, A Friendship with Muriel Spark, and he is the editor of the centenary editions of the collected novels of Muriel Spark. So, I mean, a wonderfully star-studded and interesting panel. I'm so looking forward to this. So to move to the discussion then, I'm going to turn first to Alice. You're all very, very welcome, and Alice, welcome in particular at this moment to address the question of literary celebrity, activism, and the industry, and how they condition each other. Thanks so much. If we were in real time, we'd clap now, right?
Thank you, Elke, for that lovely introduction. So yeah, it's great to be here. And one of the prompts that we were offered for this discussion was to really look at specifically the relationship between literature and politics and how it shapes our work, and the question of whether I conceive of my work as a form of political activism. And given that my work focuses on Arabic and increasingly focuses on queer work, queerness and queering, inevitably there's an activist dynamic to my work. And I would argue actually that there's a political aspect to the way that all Arabic literature and Arab culture is consumed and presented and platformed or not. And also I think it's useful to note that the Arabic literature and indeed kind of Arab culture, I want to do the air quotes again really for that, have been co-opted very, by myriad different parties and sides along the way. So I think it's a kind of, for my particular sector, it's a massive question. And obviously with the limits of time today, I'm going to try and keep an eye on the clock while I'm talking. I'm just going to zoom in on a couple of aspects that are really key to me. Of course, actually over the years, for me, activism, whether it be Palestine or Syrian revolutionary work or refugee work has always informed what I've tried to do. But of course, as an independent scholar and artist working outside of academia, although I now teach a little bit at Exeter, but I'm still independent, the economy of the way that artists in the UK, like many places, are looked after or not means there's a limit, really quite a limit on how much pro bono kind of activism work we can do. And I think for me, I define, I know that some people see the very act of intercultural dialogue or translation of culture as activism in its own right, but I think my definition is probably a bit narrower in terms of what I see as activist causes. So for me, at the moment, in recent years, it's condensed and crystallized into sort of two main themes. Actually, the biography that Elke very kindly read out was an old one from last year. So just to flag that I'm actually, because it's relevant to this presentation, I'm programming and curating a lot of queer work now. And that is problematic as a white cisgender British woman, middle class, and a host of other privileges. So I want to flag that because I think it's an interesting thing for the discussion. The two kind of key elements for me in how my work involves activism are one around queerness and queering, and then two around decolonizing Arabic to English literary translation. And these intersect, of course, in various ways. So I think that broadly speaking, one of the ways that they intersect is that queerness, queering and platforming queer work or queer voices or queer experiences is a resistance to sort of normative systems. It's a call for equality and liberation, and it seeks to lift up the silenced, and that those aspects in their broadest sense really strike at the heart of white supremacy and Western imperialism. So I see queerness as part of the anti-colonial or decolonizing mission or struggle. But to zoom in more on literature and language, which we're here to talk about today, I think that queer is inclusive, it's collaborative, it interrogates previous fixed assumptions, and it helps language to evolve. It looks at nuance, and it really asks questions, and it's open to change. And that's the kind of queer approach to things, I believe. And so I think that those things have massive value for translation, literary translation. I think they're really, really useful in that way. So that's one of the ways that these struggles intersect, of the queerness and decolonizing. So what do I mean really by decolonizing Arabic to English literary translation? What are the key issues that I think need addressing? One very entrenched issue that many people will be aware of is the culture of the kind of mysterious East, the othering of the Orient, and that the East is a kind of inherently unknowable place, and so the Arabic as a language of the East is essentially unintelligible, only approximations can really ever be found, and approximations are accepted. And so expectations are very low around literary translation in general, actually, but specifically things like convincing slang, intimate language, nuance, precision, register, sociolect. They're kind of often not really expected to happen. So that's the mysterious East. The second major factor, I think, in why we need to decolonize Arabic to English translation is the culture of the white expert above all else. And obviously I want to flag that this is where it gets problematic, because I'm now, being a white person, trying to speak as an expert. And especially around curation and cultural capital and moral credit, which I think we'll get into more in the discussion. So one of the ways that this manifests, this culture of the white expert, is, for example, that non-Arabic speaking, non-Arabophone people are in very senior positions of power. The most senior people at the BBC Arabic don't speak Arabic, for example. Let's see if I get trolled for saying that. Luckily I'm not on Twitter. And then, yeah, you know, you get kind of folks who once spent a few months in an Arabic or Arab country years ago, kind of becoming, you know, career-long experts on the so-called Middle East, as opposed to people from those countries. And I don't mean to say that there are no white experts, and I don't, you know, it's obviously, we can problematize that and not say blanket binary statements, but there is a widely noted tendency for that. I think I might be already sort of running out of time, but I'll say a couple more things. I'm not even sure if there's a facility for you to stop me on our digital platform here. The third factor that I think is massive in terms of needing to decolonize is the culture of translators having traditionally come from the officer class. And so, you know, really elite private school backgrounds and so on, and often families with colonial roles. This is really changing now, but because of the other factors, the mysterious East and so on, the paradigm stays quite entrenched. And I think something that's really key actually in the legacy from the officer class is that the sort of public school notion that one must never admit that one doesn't understand, and that is just fatal for good translation, really. And so as a result of all this, we have monolingual editing, we have monolingual assessment of translation for prizes and low standards. And I don't want to get like really bogged down in that or in dissing the whole sector, because there's so much wonderful stuff that happens. But I just want to flag that there's a really growing movement working to change the way that this all operates. And that sort of linked to that, that bringing queer Arabic work to the forefront is a way of resisting this legacy, very much a colonial Western legacy of homophobia and transphobia that has been imported into Southwest Asia and North Africa during the colonial period. So that's where I see platforming queerness as part of decolonizing. I'm going to stop because I'm not sure how long that was. I'm going to hand over to Daniel, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Hello, everyone. So I hope the microphone is on. I'm going to just spotlight a few points, since I'm looking forward to the open discussion. And given that my professional work has hovered between several different chairs, as it were, I'm not sure which direction to focus on. So, and I was thinking for the particular topics that this conference addresses, that maybe my curatorial activities, those that are the ones that probably have the widest social repercussions. So I'm active at a university, I'm a professor and a chair of a department, I direct a center for writers and translators that organizes meetings and so on. But I think probably the place of politics, and politics as an issue and as a theme, as an influencer itself, feels most pertinent to the work I do as an editor for different literary journals, the work I do and have done as a judge of various literary prizes, most of them for fiction in translation, but others for international fiction in English, but also in the position of being a board member of international literary festivals, where you actually select who do you want to come to Norway in this following year, what are, you know, which people do you want to attract and perhaps spotlight. Also being on, I think, a board member of a series with a publisher. So for example, I work with the Margolo series at Yale University Press, which means that essentially there's a larger board, and I'm one of the people who make proposals to suggest that this writer or that writer ought to appear within the series. And then when they do, that means that they have an English language publication in both the UK as well as the US, since Yale University Press is located in London and in New York. Obviously, because these activities, which I think of as forms of literary activism, and that's the angle where I feel like I come from, and that's what appeals to me the most. It can never take place in a vacuum. You can't say X, not Y, without it having some kind of social repercussion or social influence. And obviously, I think there are two different kind of ways to view politics within this sphere. On the one hand, you have the larger question of how does the politics, whether it's at the micro level or macro level, national, international, regional, how does that influence your thinking or activity in any of these tasks, whether as a juror for a literary prize or a selection for what work of fiction ought to appear in, or do I want to recommend for the White Review, for example, an English language journal. The question of like, to what extent are there non-aesthetic, extra literary considerations that might shape your decision or influence your decision? And to what extent do you want to engage in those? You know, some people are more motivated by those issues. Some people are less motivated by those issues. These are my colleagues, these are your colleagues as well. And that's one situation that I've been confronted with since I began this kind of activity. I think there's the other question, which is, to what extent do people desire or want to actually influence, I suppose this would, politics, or to influence the external world through their activity. And I suppose this would be what we call political activism. So those are two different ends of it, two different sides of it. And I've felt both in different ways in the past few years. And I'm going to kind of arbitrarily, well, I think there's one other thing that I'd like to mention here, because it's very specific to the work that I've been involved in, which, and I think of this as a virtue, but like most virtues, it has its disadvantages. Most of my activity has been not for profit. It has been non-commercial, which is to say Music and Literature magazine is registered as a charity. The White Review is registered as a charity. I do not receive a dime for my work with the Center for Writers and Translators. You know, on rare occasions, there have been benefits to this kind of activity. For example, when you do work with Booker, there is compensation for the work involved. But for the most part, when it comes to like, this is an author that I want to invest in and promote, an author that I would like to see translated into another language, an author that I would like to see if a contract exists in the United States, but not in the UK or Australia, when one engages in that kind of activity, it's hold on one moment, there's a problem with the headphone. Okay, sorry. That in every case, it is self-motivated, it is on my own time, and it is voluntary. It is out of passion, it is a labor of love. And like I said, virtue is a two-edged sword, right? On the one hand, it's the editorial work happens after 5 p.m. It's stuff that is late at night, and in most cases, it is not compensated. The great advantage to it, from my point of view, beyond getting to actually see my aesthetic preferences and literary preferences when I'm lucky, you know, sort of appear in the literary landscape, in the larger literary landscape, and is that it's, you know, I'm not required, like most people who are in the business, to make decisions on the basis of whether something is profitable or not. And I think I won't repeat too much here, because I think that the little talk by Kirsty Gunn and David Graham addressed some of these difficult questions. And like politics, many of these questions are indeed nuanced, and they're situational, and they have lots of variables, and they're not quite as black and white as they might seem to be at the beginning. So I'm just gonna have a look at the clock, so I don't know, it's a bit, I'll make a couple of I'll drop a couple of ideas, and then I'll hand the baton on further. In terms of what has been occupying me like for the last year or two, some really interesting questions about the prize juries are, in particular, and I say this because Elke is here, and I'm sure she's experienced this, is in many cases, while different members of a jury will prioritize some other aspect. For some people, it will be, these will be forms of political activism. For others, it will be aesthetic. In the worst cases, it's people trying to promote their friends, right? But what's interesting about a prize jury is that there's a kind of alchemy involved whereby the decisions that is made has to be collective. It is not individual, and it ends up compromising in many respects all of these other aspects. And what you're confronted with in the meetings themselves is the question of what to prioritize. Do you want to prioritize the symbolism of awarding this prize and this money and this publicity to this particular author? Is it that you're trying to create an effect? For example, if it's a debut novel, as in the case of the new Booker International winner, Rinus Veld, a young Dutch writer, that can launch a career. It's quite significant. Whereas if you take an established author who has been around for decades, it's, you know, another article in The Guardian and a feather in the cap, but it's not the same effect. And then you all have people the question of quality of work, and that, there are, of course, several different ways to regard quality of work, whether you do it in terms of sentences, paragraphs, character, storytelling, and you will have people who may have aesthetic priorities, but who would disagree entirely over which priorities actually ought to be more important. But I think I'll stop there, and we can continue in the larger conversation.
I'm really pleased to be here and to join in this discussion especially about the relationship between literature and politics. It's been a real pleasure to think about that over the past few days while we've been preparing for this. And I think like Daniel and Alice, I've sort of thought about the various hats that I've been wearing career-wise over the past few years, and then tried to home in on where politics and where political activism has played a role. And I think as a linguist, and having worked with literary translation for several years, it's the concepts of internationalism, of empathy, and of hospitality that come through most strongly to me. Hospitality is a word that's been really in the air for me this year, and perhaps that will come up later on in the discussion. Of course, reading literature from other languages and cultures enables us to cross borders, to see the world through others' eyes, and to gain new perspectives on that world and our relationship to it. And that's broadly my approach to this topic. So I'm hoping to have time to talk about 3 points relating to this that have come out of the work I've done over the past 10 years or so. The first one is this broad question: why is it important that we as a society read literature in translation, and why advocating for it is therefore a political act? So very much relating to what Alice was saying, but I think probably zooming out where Alice really nicely zoomed in onto the Arabic context. Secondly, what's particularly at stake when advocating for German language literature, which I did for a number of years at New Books in German. And thirdly, my current role with the Stephen Spender Trust and the Translation Exchange, getting young people in the UK reading literature in other languages and in translation. So, firstly, this really relates to my time at New Books in German, which was a wonderful 10 years until 2019. It was the experience of reading all of those books that came out of Germany, Austria and Switzerland was a lot more diverse than I expected. initially because, of course, Germany experienced a lot of migration during the second half of the 20th century, and a lot of the really good books are written by authors with a migration background. So it's written in German, but it might actually be about the former Yugoslavia, for example. And I thought I would just pick out one example, which is officially the best book that I read in German while I was at New Books in German, by a Georgian-German author called Nino Haratiashvili, The Eighth Life. And it depicts the long 20th century through the lives of 8 women from the same family from Georgia. And there's many wonderful things about this book, but I think in this context, what was so great about it is that it shows that century that's so familiar to us and the continent that is familiar to us from a perspective that is very unfamiliar for an English or American reader. The UK appears at one point. Berlin features quite heavily, which is a city I know very well. But the experience of reading that is seeing those familiar places from a new angle, rethinking our view of them, rethinking our relationship to those places. To be honest, that aspect of literature and of literature in translation seemed fairly banal and kind of obvious and almost not worth mentioning to me for my first years at New Books in German. And then 2016 came and it became clear what culture was we were living through, and what appeared to be a massive lack of empathy and hospitality in my home culture in the UK. And suddenly, for me, that cast a whole new light on my work with literary translation. It made advocating for it seem a lot more urgent and more political than it ever had done. To move on to the second point I wanted to raise, this is much less broad, thinking in particular about the German language context and how that became and how that has kind of changed in the way that it's been a political, it's been an activist role. So this working with German language literature in this country and in America becomes particularly political because of the apparently insatiable appetite of Anglo-Saxon readers for stories about World War II. If we just saw our role as promoting German language literature, it'd be very easy to do that because we could just promote books that told and retold those stories. But at New Books in German, we also had a political mission to diversify the message and the image of Germany that's being consumed in the UK and the US. So we were constantly pushing back against those stereotypes, against what the market appeared to be demanding of a German book. And that was a real focus of our work for a number of years. However, again, what became interesting around about 2016 was that the Brexit referendum and what ensued really made me rethink that approach to German literature and backtrack a little. Suddenly, it felt necessary to tell those stories again of 1930s Germany in particular, because it felt like any lessons that might have been learned in the past had been forgotten, that they weren't part of the public discourse anymore, and that felt like a dangerous position to be in. It also felt like that literature could help to move things in a more positive direction. So I found myself towards the end of my time at New Books in German actually advocating much more for those stories than I had done initially. And then the third point I wanted to raise was, it relates to what I'm doing now. So since 2018, I've been director of the Stephen Spender Trust. And I also in 2018 founded a centre at the Queen's College in Oxford called the Translation Exchange. And they both have very similar missions of getting people of all ages, but especially young people, engaging with international literature. And we mainly do that through translation. And my interest in all of this came through teaching German at universities and occasionally at schools for a number of years, becoming really concerned by the decline in language learning and by the insularity of the literary culture that young people were being exposed to. So just very briefly to say what these organisations do, I think the most relevant for our discussion is that the Stephen Spender Trust runs a prize for poetry translation, And then both organisations run translation workshops in schools that get young people interacting with, sharing stories and poems from other cultures, including their heritage cultures. Again, this has become much more explicitly political in recent years, and that's partly because of this tacit hierarchy of languages that there appears to be in this country. So to state it perhaps quite starkly and provocatively, if you're a bilingual French-English child, you're an expat with a great skill under your belt. If you're a bilingual Arabic-English speaker in a UK school, you might be seen instead as a migrant with a deficit in your learning that needs addressing. This work has also become much more urgent because the opportunities for language learning for young people are reducing, and the creative opportunities are very limited as well within that language learning. So the work we do focuses a lot on raising the profile of all languages, of trying to break down those hierarchies, celebrating all language skills in the classroom, regardless of which language it is and how good you are at it, whether you just know one word or all the words. And the prize, the Stephen Spender Prize for Poetry Translation, we're also really focusing on opening that up to a broader range of languages. We actually this week finished counting the languages that were entered this year. We had a record number of entries. We had 1,000 entries from under 18s in the UK, and the entries came from a total of 80 languages. That's 80, which is more languages than I could list. So that feels like, to go back to how I started with hospitality and empathy, access to other voices, that feels like a very positive step. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how we can continue to develop in that direction. So that was all I wanted to say for my introduction. Advocating for literature and translation is a political act. The role that German literature can play in informing the public discourse, and the urgency of reimagining language learning and literary translation, international culture for young people. And I will now pass over to Alan Taylor. Thank you.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here and to have a chat with you all in these circumstances, these weird circumstances. The first thing to say is I don't really regard myself as a literary activist. I think of myself, I guess, if I think of myself at all, as a literary advocate. And I realised, sort of looking back, most of my career has been trying to encourage people in every sphere of life I've worked in to read good books and to promote good books. Having said that, always difficult to define what is a good book. But it's such a vast topic, this, and difficult to know on which bits of it to alight. But I'll just go like a butterfly for 5 minutes, and then we can hopefully discuss more later on. But I'd like, first of all, just to talk about the Booker Prize, because it has come up among a few of us. And it's worth remembering that the Booker Prize was started in 1969 by a company called Booker McConnell, which had its interest mainly in the Caribbean and in the sugar trade, so probably wouldn't be acceptable these days. And the reason why the prize was founded was that booksellers and publishers in particular realized that the literary novel was in the doldrums. Nobody was buying it, very few people were reading it, sales were really very low, and publishers, booksellers got together to start a new prize which they hoped would promote it. And it has been, of course, very successful, as we've seen, as it's sort of flourished and grown wings and added new prizes to its portfolio. I come at from a kind of odd angle, actually, because back in the day, in the late 1980s, I became a member of the Booker Management Committee. So I saw the Booker operating from within, and it was chaired by a wonderful guy called Sir Michael Caine, who was the head of the Booker McConnell organisation, and people on the board like Malcolm Bradbury, Tim Waterston, people of that ilk. There wasn't a big board. And our role was to amend the rules, and they were just amended very slightly every year, to decide on the prize money, and there really was no limit to the prize money. Booker said if you want to put it up, you could put it up, you can leave it as it is, etc. And very crucially, to select the judges. So here were 5 or so middle-aged well, I wasn't so middle-aged then, white guys, what you might call part of the chatterati, if not the literati, selecting judges. And I was a fairly naive person in those days when it came to this. We did realise at that point that, believe it or not, politicians made good chairmen of judges because they were used to chairing committees and used to getting decisions out of people. And so we had people like Michael Foot, the ex-Labour leader, who was an exceptional chairman because he not only read books, but he was a very, very good person at getting committees to come to a decision. Anyway, we move on to 1993, and this is when I began to realise the sort of political angle to the book, and also that not everybody might share everybody's sense of, let's find a book. This was a Booker's cause. Find a book that's the best novel of that year, but which might be read 25, 30, 40 years from that point. And in 1993, I don't need to remember, but a couple of judges said they would walk out if Trainspotting, Irving Welsh's novel, made it onto the long list. So suddenly here was this realization that a group of judges based in a sort of London-centric bubble were confronted with a novel which they hadn't a clue what was going on. And so Trainspotting didn't make it. But the following year, I became a judge, and James Kelman won the Booker Prize, the only time a Scot has won the Booker Prize. You may call it coincidence, I can't possibly comment. But one of our judges, having tried to read the book on 3 separate attempts, thought that this decision was terrible. She thought that there was no way a book in which there were 26 uses of the F word per page could possibly be a literary novel. And she literally did walk out. And Kelman subsequently won the Booker. But what was interesting about that whole thing was that I had some very great sympathy for that judge, because try as she might to understand what was going on in Kelman's novel, she couldn't, because she was outside that culture. And I think it might have been Charlotte who said that, well, books introduce us to new cultures, new places, new languages. Yeah, they do, but we need to be open to these ideas and thoughts. But when we open a book, we must try to open ourselves up to what the author is trying to say. But alas, she tried and she failed and it didn't work. But of course, what happened then, and this was really quite instructive, was that when Kelman won it, the backlash was absolutely ferocious from the so-called literati of the metropolitan classes. And he was denounced in the most astonishing terms, racist terms, I would call it, classist terms. You know, he was called something like a noble savage and an illiterate. We remembered in Scotland the put down for Robert Burns as a heaven-taught ploughman. And that was the way that James Kelman seemed to be regarded, despite the fact that prior to 1994, he had been shortlisted for another of his novels. And I think if you were to ask him now whether winning the Booker Prize was a good thing, I think he would be ambivalent at best. I don't think he feels it did him a great service. And the other thing I would say about prizes, because prizes are what leads a lot to literary celebrity, is that we judged that year 130 books. And of course, that is absolutely absurd. No judge can read 130 books. And it's not in a year, by the way, it's in 10 months. And you have to read several of these books 2 times. And so that can't happen. And something needs to be done about that whole culture. We recently had in Scotland, for example, a prize called the Scottish Book of the Year Prize. And one of the judges on the prize for the best novel of the year refused to read one of the novels because it was too long. And they didn't have 130 to read. But anyway, that's something just to say about literary prizes and celebrity, because I think the Booker was the beginning of true literary celebrity in the 20th century. It was also, I've recognised my own day job as a literary editor and as the editor of Scottish Review of Books. It's been my job to try and forefront Scottish literature, because although we are part of the UK, still part of the UK, it's very often the case that Scottish books don't get reviewed in the London press. And so we have to prioritise that. And so that's part of the literary activism that we have. And the final thing I'd like to say, because I'd like to get into a discussion about various aspects of what the others have been talking about, is about book festivals. And Daniel mentioned that, you know, in one of the roles he has, he can be selecting people to attend at particular festivals. And this is a very powerful position to be in. And the grant-giving bodies are in very powerful positions because they can give favours to people to go and do things in exotic places, and most people like to go and do these things. Well, the book festival, the Modern Book Festival, as you know, it was invented in Edinburgh in 1983, and it was a very modest literary festival at that time. Had some very good names, some fantastic writers, was very international in scope, even back then. But I don't know how many people were there. There'd be 100 at that time. This year, if the Edinburgh International Book Festival had gone ahead, there would have been 800 to 900 writers there. But it has been remarked there that among people looking at the festival's programs going back and forth, that there's a great homogeneity of views. They tend to be left-leaning, liberal, etc., anti-Brexit. And while they may be my views, or the views I find sympathetic towards, they're not covering the whole spectrum. And I think that this is another aspect of the whole literary celebrity thing. And one final point is that young writers entering their careers see these literary festivals and they want to appear at them because that's their equivalent of the rock festival. As one publisher says, they're printing the t-shirt before we've actually got the book out. And I think this is something that has happened in recent times. This is a modern phenomenon in the literary world, and one I personally slightly old-fashionedly bemoan. But perhaps I should stop there because it looks as if we've got just 10 minutes in which to solve the world's ills.
Hi again, everyone, and thanks to our panelists for some incredibly provocative and interesting observations. I mean, there's so much there. I don't think we can do justice to everything. There's certainly a lot of food for thought. A few kind of key words that I wanted to pull out, and then perhaps just put one question to the panel, and then we can have some time for Q&A, tight as it is I mean, there was some interesting points made about translation itself as a kind of literary activism. There was a lot of interest in prize cultures and the culture of literary festivals, and so the whole kind of industry around book publishing as also a kind of activism. And then, interestingly, kind of threaded through everyone's commentaries was this idea of activism as a resisting of stereotypes. It was there what Alice was saying about Arabic writers. It was there in what Charlotte was saying about how German literature is perceived. It was there in Daniel's remarks and also in Alan's remarks about book prizes. So I just wanted to just to pick up on that idea of resisting stereotypes, whether of books or writers or languages or cultures, as itself an activism, and one that literature in all its forms can promote. So I just put it to you, the panel, to see if you'd like to pick up on that.
I'd be happy to speak to that. Hello. Could I start, Ilika?
Go for it.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought that they were all such fascinating contributions, and we could clearly sit here all afternoon. But on resisting stereotypes, I think that's it is absolutely central, and I think that's one of the reasons why I'm currently so obsessed with this this work that we're doing with young people and with getting a diverse literature to them and giving them the opportunity to engage with it in this very interactive way, because that's what translation is. You know, it's always interactive, and it's the way that we do it is very collaborative as well. And I think what that does is it reaches it. it gets a diverse set of images and ideas to the children, hopefully before the stereotypes kick in. I think it would be really interesting to see, you know, we only have sort of anecdotal evidence at the moment, but I think it'd be really interesting to see what impact that does have on the formation of stereotypes as they get older. And, you know, the hope is that, that it kind of, it cuts in before things become, before, you know, what they hear from their parents, what they hear from the press, starts to solidify in their minds, and they start to have these very fixed ideas about what a certain culture is like. I can just think, you know, we've done some workshops with primary kids with Polish poetry, where, you know, at the beginning of the session we talked to them about Poland and Polish, and in some cases there are some Polish speakers, but in most cases they haven't had direct experience of it, and so what we give them and what they get through that workshop is this really rich, kind of exciting, creative experience of Poland and Polish, which I hope then is, you know, becomes a bedrock for how they might view that culture, where without getting too, you know, depressing about it all, you know, there are other stereotypes that may develop as they get older and listen to the media and so on. So I think that would be my response to that question.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. Anyone else from the panel?
I just wanted to really quickly say that actually when I heard you talking, Charlotte, about hospitality, I was like, oh yeah, that's right. I do actually define literary translation as activism. I was like, must remember that. Yeah, thank you for flagging that, and everything that you're saying about the post-2016 landscape is so super important.
Yeah, it's interesting that, you know, here in Scotland, the sort of major debate at the moment is not Brexit, it's about the union and the independence movement. And I remember as a newspaper editor, the cultural community was overwhelmingly in favour of nationalism and independence. And it was very difficult to find a kind of antithetical point of view. You couldn't find somebody who said, well, I'm going to stand up for the union, I'm going to be pro a conservative government. We talk about diversity in the literary and arts field, but really we're not a very diverse bunch of people. We are people who think very much alike. And it's the ones who stand out, they're supposed to be the weirdos, but usually they're the majority governments. So the public are voting for a particular kind of government or a particular kind of activism, whereas the cultural community says, well, no, we support liberalism, we're left-leaning, we're nationalists or whatever. It's like in the US where, you know, every TV program about the presidency always has a Democrat president in charge, whereas actually, as we know, that's not the case.
Daniel, did you want to come in at all?
Yes, of course. Of course. I think on the one hand, it's true that we all share something in common, is the desire to shatter insular forms of literary culture. In my case, it's for formal reasons. There are other motivations that might be behind that, but of course that we want to promote new ways of writing, and which help in turn, I think, at least if you're thinking in terms of the novel, expand the possibilities of the novel. Many of whose most interesting innovations have been transmitted or inspired through translation from one culture, one language into another. But it's also curious, given what Ellen has brought up, that in some cases, this is interlingual, or from one language to another. And I think thanks to some of the activities of people like Charlotte and Alice in the past few years, there's been much more attention devoted in the broader literary culture. And this includes prizes from everywhere, from the Booker International, which is now an annual award for the best work in translation within that language, to even the fact that the National Book Award in the United States has adopted a translation prize after having dropped it for 20 years or something like that. But it's curious that you can have those same problems, which is to say literary linguistic complacency, in the same language. not just in the Anglosphere, but I think it's fascinating to hear the stories about Kelman, which is one of these notorious juries that year that I'd heard about. And of course, it's curious to me because given my aesthetic orientation, which is largely continental, modernist, and looking for things that I haven't seen before, I mean, Kelman is one of the few Booker winners from that period that I'm familiar with today, and that who appeals to me now precisely because of what he's doing and its differences. And that so it's curious how you can go in both directions. And one thing that I found fascinating is that there are so many, and infuriating, is that the variables keep shifting. There are the regional ones, New York is one particular, and of course there are similarities between New York and London and even Edinburgh. But having worked on German translation prizes, the political question, the political equations differ. There is a Palestinian novel that was published in the UK this year by Adenia Shibli, whose point of departure is the gang rape of a Palestinian woman in 1948 in the Negev desert, right? That's the point of departure. That's all you need to know. It has been translated into many languages, including UK English. But for example, the one country where they're having problems is Germany. They're having problems finding a German publisher for this book. There's another author, Katarina Faulkner, who's actually working for a London literary agency, and her debut novel, The Appointment, has just been published, and it has been sold to many other countries, and it's dealing with Judaism, it's dealing with identity, it's dealing with sex, and so on. And again, it's in Germany where certain taboos exist within the people who make these decisions. And that's, even though she herself is German, and I had studied either at Oxford or Cambridge, German literature and language, which is to say, and she works for an agency that serves a lot of international clients, and they deal with international, you'd think this would be simple, but they can't break through to Germany because of those specific sensitivities that exist in Berlin, but not in London.
It's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think we could spend a whole hour also talking about last year's Booker Prize decision, which was clearly, even though there's very little that's been published about, you know, what happened there. I'm sure we'll find out in due course. You know, there was clearly a political decision was made with the award of effectively 2 prizes to Margaret Atwood and Bernardine Evaristo, both fantastic writers, very, very deserving books. It would have been fascinating to be part of that discussion, I'm sure, very political discussion, I have no doubt, and one that would also have touched on the whole question of literary celebrity, because I can think of few more successful literary celebrities than Margaret Atwood. But time, unfortunately, is running extremely short. So I'm going to turn to the organizers and ask if we can squeeze in just one question, if there is one, from the wider audience of listeners today. I'm just
great. So we've got a
yes.
question here from Kieran Hazard, which I think sort of speaks to some of the things that you've been talking about, which comes back to something which keeps coming up in the discussions that we've had over the course of the summer, which is money and economics. And it did sort of, it struck me while I was listening, like, would a James Kelman today be able to start their career just in terms of like the loss of kind of the welfare safety net, or with kind of funding, or the kind of financial precarity that goes along with that. So Kieran, I'm just hijacking his question, but Kieran was asking, how much do you think financial and commercial concerns influence which writers are published and what they say? So not just kind of, do they get a platform, but does it shape what they say?
Well, can I just answer that first? Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, well, the first thing to say is that it influences it hugely, because publishers now have access to data and statistics, the like of which they never had before, and they adopt and discard writers annually based on their statistics and how their sales are going. James Kelman was originally published by the student publishing wing of Edinburgh University Press, of Edinburgh University, not Edinburgh University Press. And I'm so old, I can remember reading his first collection of stories because it came in a manuscript to the Scottish Arts Council for a grant. And none of us had a clue what he was doing. None of us on the board, 5 of us read this, we hadn't a clue. So we thought, well, we better give it a grant then, because we've never seen anything like that. The other thing to say is that James Kelman, for all his reputation, and it is huge, does not live high on the hog. He lives in very, very modest circumstances in Glasgow, and I still see him from time to time. He's still working very hard. He's still angry about a lot of things, and he's still writing brilliantly. Yeah. But I don't know who would take that risk with him nowadays. But we see anyway, certainly in Scotland, a fair number of young writers, and I've got a couple sitting in the hall at the moment, not the writers, their books, who are clearly influenced by Jim Kelman. So he has had quite a wider influence. And I think a certain breed of Scottish writer, from Ali Smith, Kirsty Gunn, bunch of others, would all, acknowledge that Jim Kelman was quite an influence on them, and they have huge admiration for him.
Thanks, Alan. Ruth, I'm just looking at you in terms of time, because I mean, it's always the case that the discussion just starts to flow when.
Yeah, we've got until 10 past.
Okay, do we? Okay, brilliant. And we can go on a little bit. I have a wonderful. So does anyone else want to come in on?
I'll jump in and say something about money. Yeah.
Money.
I think something that, so going back to my quite specific context of Arabic literature in translation, so there's a kind of self-perpetuating thing that happens whereby Arabic literature is not really very commercially viable in translation. Tends to have to be done for little money, and this translation sector is badly remunerated in general. So then in the main, that means that a lot of the people who can afford to do it have to be, I don't know this expression, high on the hog, but I'm going to start using it to some extent, right? And in some cases, those are amazing, wonderful translators, but in some cases, it skews the demographic in a certain way. And especially so, both if you're hoping that certain really subaltern voices come through, they won't necessarily be chosen by the people. It's this question of gatekeeping, really. So there's gatekeeping kind of upstream at publisher level, but there's also a certain amount of gatekeeping in terms of who can afford to take on work. So really, to answer the question about money, yeah, it's very, very, very intimately influencing what we get to read and in what kind of version.
Yeah, I would second that, or third that. I'm really glad that money has come up. It's one of the notes that I wrote listening to everybody, because Alice, you talked about pro bono activism, and Daniel, you talked about doing your editing work in the evenings. And, these are all privileged positions that we're in to be able to do our activism out of office hours. But it's clearly a problem. It clearly does define the demographic in a certain way, and it's something that's been troubling me for a long time, and especially I think over the past couple of years since I've been involved more in the charity sector, because Stephen Spender Trust is a charity, and that's the first time that I've worked for a literary charity, and sort of seeing things from the inside and funding issues and so on. So I don't have an answer apart from to reiterate what Alice says about it being so central and so problematic, and I think there's lots to be done, which is another form of activism.
We in Scotland have a thing called Creative Scotland, and they're the main arts funding body, and so it's virtually the only place people can go to get actually arts funding, which is good, but it's also bad, because you're beholden to this organisation and you have to behave yourself. I call it Cremative Scotland because I don't think they're particularly creative. But in Ireland, they used to have a thing called Éis Dana, where it was almost like an academy. And if you were part of that academy, and it was the members of the academy who could vote new members on, So therefore you got an annual stipend, which was open-ended. It wasn't just going to end after 3 years. It was open-ended until, you know, you wanted to come off. You might not take the money or whatever. And I remember John Banville, who was a member of it, and he said he wanted to come off to allow a new, younger person to come on who needed the money, and they wouldn't let him come off. But I don't know if that still pertains in Ireland now. And then they had an income tax free thing for creative people too. There's a very interesting kind of time there in Ireland, but I don't know of any other country that operates that kind of thing. Maybe Soviet Russia used to do it.
It is interesting in terms of literary festivals, and turning back to Daniel's remarks on festivals and also yours, Alan, kind of who gets invited and who doesn't. I've done some work with a couple of literary festivals in the past 10 to 15 years, and you know it's always the case that you need to build, according to the organizers, you need to build a sort of spinal column of big names before you can risk, you know, festival funding on the smaller names who may only pull in a crowd of about, you know, 10 or 11. So, you know, in that sense, money and the kind of the capital that different writers represent, their name, their reputation, their celebrity represents, is again key. And it's, speaking of prizes, it's interesting how prize, to have won a prize, or even to be shortlisted, but increasingly less so, to actually have won changes everything. I don't know if anyone saw the fascinating, I really recommend it, conversation between Nicola Sturgeon and Bernardine Evaristo. It was, you know, it was on Zoom, I think, at the Edinburgh Book Fair 10 days ago, in which Evaristo talks fascinatingly about many things, but for this conversation in particular about the difference that the Booker Prize has made. You know, I mean, she worked for 25 years, a bit like Kelman, you know, as a theatre activist, as a, you know, as a performance poet, and also, of course, as a literary writer. None of that went recognized in the right way until the award of the Booker Prize.
But that has something to do with the resources of the prize and the imprint that it leaves, which has to do with money, but it's also the decisions they make. And so it's interesting that some of these middlemen or mediators, for example, I think the source of hope for many people have been in the last few years as commercial constraints limit the creativity among the big publishers. Many of these smaller publishers, independent presses in the UK and the US, have taken over, which is to say they're publishing these interesting books, and even while they're working on a much smaller scale and budget, the prizes like the Booker help magnify them. I think Fitzcarraldo in London has only been in existence for 4 years, but they have always had 1 to 2 titles on the short list of the International Booker. And now they have 2 Nobel authors within those 4 years. And so, and that has something to do with savvy, fortune, and the way people promote. I think this is very particular to our age, and perhaps was not the case 20 years ago, the extent to which an awareness of the market, the purchasing environment, how something is advertised. I think it's always made a difference. But these days, I don't think you can, there are dozens of great small presses out there. They won't all have the same quality of editing. They won't all receive the same amount of attention just because the book is getting published, or because it's received money from French Voices or from some other kind of subsidy. Those things all help. But it often comes down to specific decisions and the way some mediator in between that is able to make people more receptive, beginning with journalists, festivals, jury readers, right? That for whatever reasons, they are more receptive, and that enables this text to make its way through the world.
Fantastic. I think in the interests of time, Ruth, I'm looking at you. We probably
we should probably
start wrapping now.
a shame, because this is the point
yeah.
where it'd be great to go and have a glass of wine and carry on talking.
It would,
Just say
but
where,
unfortunately we can't do that. We can only do that in the privacy of our own homes. So I do recommend that, you know, you go off and have the beverage that best suits your time of day now to everyone. I think we've generated a number of really interesting questions and questions to take away with us and ponder some more as we read further and think further about literary celebrity and turn back to the work of James Kelman. I remember jumping and leaping and yelling through the living room when he won, because I was a big fan back then and remain so now. Do give him our regards, Alan. I'd like very much to thank all the panelists, Charlotte, Daniel, Alan, Alice. I'd like to thank Art in Action for hosting this great conversation, for bringing these topics into the frame, and thank you to the audience. I hope you've enjoyed it, and come back for more discussion next week.
Yeah, well, I should say our next event is actually Friday the 18th. We've got a week off, but the next panel will be an equally star-studded and distinguished panel, if possible, talking about PEN International. So it'd be great to see people there, and all you have to do is go to the link in the chat to register. And thank you all very much, and thank you, Elika, for chairing.